All right, let's bring in Sean Stevens. He's with the excellent Civil Liberties Organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. He's the Director of Polling and Analytics there. Sean, great to have you with us today.
Hi, yeah, thanks to be here.
I was really intrigued by the fact that you have just released a list of the best universities and the worst universities for free speech, and this is something you do on an annual basis?
Yeah, this is the fourth year in a row we've done this. We started doing this in 2020.
And how do you measure, before we get to the actual results, how do you measure whether or not an institution is good when it comes to free speech versus terrible?
Yeah, so we have, there's two major categories of components, and then within them there's some subcomponents. So very briefly, there's a survey where we ask the students at these individual schools, basically like kind of what's their experience like with expressing themselves on campus in different settings, how tolerant they are of different kinds of controversial speakers, what do they think about the administration, would they defend free speech, do they make their stance on that clear, that they would defend the speaker during a controversy, questions like that. And we use that to make up survey components that we call kind of like the student perception components.
Mm-hmm.
And then we factor in other research that FIRE does, where we have a policy reform team that rates the student speech code policies that a school has on the books. So anything kind of in a student handbook that could potentially be used to regulate speech,
right.
They're evaluated for whether they are, they pass constitutional muster or not, or if they're arbitrarily worded, or if they clearly infringe on speech. So we kind of have a tiered system there.
Right. So on that front, if I can, I know that for years, I know that for years, FIRE has been fighting against, say, these things called free speech zones on campus. Sometimes college campuses will say, well, you're only allowed to engage in free speech inside this tiny circle on the quad. You can stand there and engage in free speech, but beyond that, you're not allowed. And FIRE is very much against that.
Yeah, that would be an example of a speech code that we would give like a yellow or red light rating, depending on how it's worded.
Right.
So that's like part of our tiered system. And then we have other databases that we maintain where we track, the presence and then the outcomes of speech controversies on campus. So we have something called the Campus Disinvitation Database. So this looks at campaigns to disinvite speakers from campus and then the outcomes that occur there. So schools get a bonus if they defend the speaker's rights, and there's a penalty if a disinvitation occurs or an event is disrupted while it's going on.
So if the campus is not hospitable to the speaker, so they allow the speaker on campus, but it gets shouted down, the speech has to get canceled, that would work against the school.
Yeah, that works against the school, and if they defend the speaker, in the face of a controversy, they would get a bonus. And then we have two others, one that we're still working on building, and it's not like fully public yet, but the other one is we have what we call Scholars Under Fire database. So this is effectively, it's similar to the campus disinvitation one, but it's basically attempts to get professors or other kinds of researchers on campus sanctioned for either their research, their expression in that way, like their academic expression, or it could be just their general free expression, like they've given their views on social media or something like that.
Got it.
And they get targeted. And we're building an equivalent database like that for students and like student groups, student organizations. So those were incorporated this year for the first. That last grouping, the student groups and organizations, that was incorporated this year for the first time.
Got it. Great. So one of the things that you make me think of is you talk about speech controversies in particular is that sometimes universities impose fees on organizations with disfavored political views, claiming that they need to cover the costs of extra security. They'll put a fee down. They'll be like, hey, we've got it. Sorry, your speaker's too controversial. We're going to need a bunch of extra cops. It's going to cost you thousands of dollars to bring security into this event. Would that work against the institution in terms of their free speech score?
Yeah, there's examples where it does. If it's clear that it's been arbitrarily applied, and there's even some cases where student organizations have sued schools and won the lawsuits that they had imposed unconstitutional security fees on them. So yes, those would work against universities if they're in our disinvitation database.
Okay. All right. Let's go through the rankings here. Let's begin, I would say, with the worst. Who are the worst institutions in the country when it comes to free speech?
So I'll give you two groups on that because there's this year and then there's what we can say about across the 4 years. So this year, the bottom five are Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of South Carolina, Georgetown, and Fordham.
Wow.
And then a handful of schools from the other bucket, which includes a good chunk of the ones I just named, schools that have performed consistently, near the bottom of the rankings in at least 3 of the 4 years that we've surveyed. We've done the survey. So every year we've actually added schools to the rankings. So I'm now only focusing on schools we've had in there at least three times.
Right.
And so the schools I'd say are, consistently perform badly are Harvard and Georgetown, as mentioned, and Fordham. And then you have Marquette, Rensselaer, Polytechnic Institute. University of Pennsylvania was the second to worst last year, too. So I think they're kind of trending in that direction. There's some others, but we can go on to the, good performing schools now. That's a smattering. That's a smattering of some of the, fairly bad ones.
Well, here's what worries me in no small part about this. Some of the schools you named also include some of the top law schools in the country. Are those considered in this assessment, or is this just undergrad?
So our survey is only of undergraduates.
Got it.
The disinvitation database and the incident databases, those can include things that occurred at like a graduate school event or a school of law, which is essentially generally they're often on the same campus.
Yeah.
And so the high profileness of an event like that. We imagine there's undergraduates who aren't oblivious to it.
Right.
So those incidents are included, but we only survey undergraduates, and the speech code evaluation is of like the student handbook, which, probably applies more strictly to undergraduates because graduate students tend to often kind of straddle their faculty sometimes and employees sometimes, and sometimes their students, and it's like a little weirder.
Sure. But it is worrisome, though, that places like the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard and Georgetown, these are institutions that churn out some of the top lawyers in the entire country, and they are places where free speech is suffocated. What kind of members of society are these institutions churning out?
Yeah, and I think that's a reason that I think more broadly, one should be concerned whether or not they plan to or know anyone who attends these schools or has attended these schools. As you pointed out, these are some of the most influential institutions in the country, and so presumably a lot of the graduates from these institutions are going to, find their way into prestigious, influential positions in various industries.
Right.
So I think these attitudes matter.
Yes, for sure. Okay, and then you do have the best. There are some schools that are performing well in this survey. Who are they?
Yeah, so I'll do the same thing. I'll give you the top 5 this year, and then the bucket of schools that we can say over the 4 years we've been doing this, we're fairly confident are good schools at this. And so the 5 best this year are Michigan Tech, Auburn, University of New Hampshire, Oregon State, and Florida State. And then I'd say consistently across the past 4 years, the schools that have performed well and essentially always been in the top 25 are, some of it includes some of the schools I just said. It includes University of New Hampshire, it includes Auburn, it includes Oregon State, it includes Florida State. This is the first year we surveyed Michigan Tech, so we can't say much about them. To that group, I'd add University of Chicago, Kansas State, Mississippi State, George Mason, Purdue, University of Virginia, NC State, and Colorado Boulder.
Wow, okay, some good news. A couple local schools in there for us too.
Yeah.
So as you say that, when these are the type of schools the fire assesses that are more accommodating to diverse viewpoints and would allow conflicting opinions to exist on campus and for a more robust debate.
Yeah, the survey results vary at the different schools on the different, I've mentioned there's a number of subcomponents from the survey things. So, some of the schools that do well, there's still some components where there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. They don't necessarily do well on that one component.
Sure.
But typically they're doing average, they're not doing poorly on, too many of these. They have what we would call all of them have green light speech code policies, which means there's nothing that overtly threatens speech in their student handbook regulations. It doesn't necessarily mean everything's perfect and they're not going to crack down on things.
Yes.
For instance, University of Chicago was number one, number two, number one the first 3 years, and this year's number 13. The sole reason they're not number two, which they would be, is they denied recognition to a student organization this year. And we felt that it was on, it was basically a viewpoint discriminatory basis, and the policy was applied arbitrarily.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what's the trend when it comes to speech and these campuses? Obviously, that we've seen a lot of change over, especially it seems like the last 5 years. My impression from the outside of academia is that schools are becoming more censorial and less open to diverse viewpoints. What is the trend?
Yeah. So in our survey data, I'd say most of the survey data in terms of trend lines over the 4 years, we've generally, not every question has been asked every single 4 years, but there's a core set of questions that have been asked at least every year for 3 of the 4 years, and there's like a handful of questions that were asked every year. So comfortable talking about trends on these. I'd say like on a lot of those, the trends are stagnant, and by stagnant I wouldn't mean good, because you wouldn't necessarily think the numbers are great, but they haven't really moved around much. But then there are a few data points that came this year that we'll see what happens next year, but they could be a cause for concern if the trend continues. We asked questions about the acceptability of different types of protest, and effectively like liberal forms of protest to stop a campus speech. And so we ask if how acceptable is it to block entry into an event, for students to block entry into an event on campus, and how acceptable is it for students to use violence to stop a campus speech. And they have 4 response options ranging from always acceptable to never. And so if we toss out never and we just focus on the people who have, if we focus on never and toss out the other 3. Last year, 63% of students said blocking entry was never acceptable. It's now 55. For violence, last year, 80% said it was never acceptable. It's now 73.
Wow. And this is among undergraduate college students?
Yes. This is undergraduates. Yeah.
Okay.
So those are, trend. I wouldn't necessarily call that a trend.
Well, yeah, with 2 data points, but that certainly it's headed in the wrong direction.
But it's something where if that kind of stays at the level it's at this year, next year or drops even further, then it might be cause for bigger concern.
Are there? I know you're a nonpartisan organization, but do you detect partisan patterns in any of this?
So I think the honest question to that is the majority of campuses, the students predominantly identify as liberal.
Yes.
That's going to be the case for faculty too. We know that, but there are a handful of campuses where that's not the case, and it flips around. And we do have a couple campuses where it's very conservative in a sense. And so I think the most honest thing to say is what's common across the campuses is hostility towards the minority viewpoint, like whichever that is. And granted, it's going to more often be on the minority viewpoint is going to be a right of center conservative viewpoint. But when that's not the case, you see it totally flip around, and it's the liberal viewpoint that kind of receives.
Sure. I get that it's more likely to be rejected, but that makes sense. But the means by which that viewpoint's rejected, I think, matters. So do you see any evidence of conservative campuses using violence or shutting down events to prevent those?
Those are actually rare events on kind of the campuses that skew more conservative. And then kind of in the broader question to what you asked, more broadly a little while ago.
Right.
I'd say in trend, so back to the trend part, it's like in the survey data, a little bit, not so much, stagnant at best, maybe some things getting worse. In our databases where we observe the incidents and record these different incidents and controversies, that's where we're seeing upticks recently.
Got it. All right. Well, I'm glad you're out there tracking it. You've been doing it for a long time. You have a great organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Sean Stevens does polling and analytics there. Sean, thank you very much for giving us this assessment today.